was constantly lying about things. And so the fact that he would say that he was, you know, positive toward Christianity is not really to be believed, unless we can show from evidence that he did actually hold these beliefs in private and in other kinds of ways. And in fact, the opposite is the case. What we find out in private, and it also even sometimes maybe in public, Hitler did distance himself from Christianity.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel is a place where we like to do theology videos, church history videos, and Protestant apologetics videos, insofar as Protestantism is an umbrella. Although today, we're not so much doing Protestant apologetics as we normally do. We're more going to be in the, I guess, history and theology, or I guess more broadly, religion side of things for this channel. As I'm sure some of you guys listening at home may have noticed on Twitter, there's been a very bizarre uptick. I feel like, at least in my algorithm, I guess, or the stuff that my algorithm is showing me on Twitter, of people that are just bizarrely kind of being friendly toward the Nazis, or are doing World War II and Holocaust revisionism. Right. And there's just a lot of bizarre stuff running around, from anonymous accounts to actually, named people and accounts kind of going to bat for this stuff. And I've started to see also an uptick, again, at least in my feed, of people claiming that, Nazi Germany was actually ostensibly Christian, and that they're just being maligned and lied about. And the post war consensus has brought about all this lying about the Nazis and Hitler, and to the point where you have some of these people even saying that Hitler was like the last Christian prince, and all other things, sorts of things that I would consider, frankly, ridiculous, to put my cards on the table. But I thought, hey, you know what? I am personally not at this current moment equipped with the historical knowledge to address the question of Hitler's religion, right, and Hitler's stance on these various things. And so I thought I would bring on someone who is actually qualified to talk on these things, who has been studying this for many years and has even written a book on the subject. And so with us today, I have Dr. Richard, is it Weikart or Weikart?
Weikart. I mean, when I'm in Germany, I pronounce it Weikart because it is a German name, but it's
Weikart.
Weikart.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, we have Dr. Richard Weikart here. Dr. Weikart completed his PhD in modern European history at the University of Iowa in 1994, receiving the biennial prize of the Forum for the History of Human Sciences for the best dissertation in that field. His revised dissertation, titled Socialist Darwinism, Evolution in German Socialist Thought from Marx to Bernstein, was published in 1999. He worked as professor emeritus of history at California State University, Stanislaus, or he is professor emeritus of history at California State University, Stanislaus. And he is the author of From Darwin to Hitler, Hitler's Ethic, The Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress, and Hitler's Religion, The Twisted Ideas That Drove the Third Reich. How are you doing today, Dr. Richard?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you once again for being willing to come on the channel and lend your expertise to this subject. Like I was telling you prior to filming, I feel like there's a lot of confusion online, and it's very easy online. I feel like all of our parents growing up, at least in my generation, told us like, "Hey, don't believe everything you see online." And I feel like a lot of us have not, taken that advice. And people claim all sorts of things, and there's a lot of confusion online about Hitler and the Nazis and everything, like I said a few seconds ago. And so I appreciate you for being willing to come on and talk about this. And so let me put your presentation on the screen. All right, then I'm going to go ahead, brother, and subtract myself from the screen, let you get onto your presentation. And whenever you want me to move on to the next slide, just say, next slide, please, and I'll do that for you. So I'll let you get to it.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I'm going to be talking today about Hitler's religion. We're going to look at issues relating to Hitler and Christianity in particular, because there have been, for a long time, in fact, many atheists and skeptics, religious skeptics, who have routinely blamed Hitler for atrocities and have blamed those on Christianity, interestingly. So it's not, whereas Javier was talking about people today who are sympathizing with Hitler, there are a lot of atheists and skeptics who over the years have blamed, who have been anti Hitler, an anti-Christian, and so claimed that Hitler sort of blamed all of Nazi atrocities on Christianity. And there's really two lines of arguments that are really the strongest arguments that are brought forward by people who try to bring Hitler into this orbit of Christianity. One is that they claim that Christian anti-Semitism is responsible for Nazi anti-Semitism and thus the Holocaust. The second line of approach is to claim that Hitler himself was a Christian. And so let me take each of those in turn. First of all, how to respond to those that claim that the Holocaust was the result of Christian anti Semitism. Well, first of all, I think we as Christians need to admit that there has been a lot of anti Jewish sentiment and rhetoric in the churches over the centuries, although at the same time, there actually have been a lot of statements more tolerant and loving toward the Jews as well. We need to recognize that both things have been going on, but we do need to recognize that a lot of the so-called anti-Semitism, as it came about in modern times, some of it did stem from prejudices by the Roman Catholic Church as well as the Protestant churches in the continent. Uh, but we also need to understand that anti Semitism is completely contrary to the teachings of Jesus, Peter, and Paul, who all happened to be Jews themselves. Interestingly, Jesus at one time in John chapter 4 said, "Salvation is of the Jews." Hitler, by the way, and other anti Semites hated that Bible passage and believed that it wasn't an authentic saying of Jesus or whatever, because they didn't think Jesus would have said something like that. But Jesus said salvation is of the Jews. Jesus is called the King of the Jews. He's called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So he's definitely identified with the Jews, and in his genealogies in both Matthew and Luke, both of those genealogies trace him back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he was, and Judah. And so he definitely was a Jew himself. Peter and Paul, the two of the key founders, as well as John and other key founders of the Christian faith, were also Jews themselves. So clearly they weren't teaching anti-Semitism and opposition to the Jews. On the contrary, they were holding the Jews in very high esteem in many ways. Again, they themselves were Jews, but converted to Jesus as the Messiah. But there's another way to look at this problem also about the issue of Christian anti Semitism leading to the Holocaust. And that is that Hitler's anti Semitism was not the same as the kind of Christian anti-Jewish sentiment that had been in place before that time. In fact, Hitler in the Mein Kampf actually criticizes the Christian churches for being too friendly to the Jews. And Hitler embraced a form of anti Semitism that was completely contrary to the notions of Christianity. So, Christians over the centuries, say let's Martin Luther gets slammed a lot of times for his anti-Semitism because he made anti-Jewish comments. By the way, the word anti-Semitism didn't exist in Luther's time. It only came about in the 19th century. But he did speak out against the Jews and talked about burning their synagogues and driving them out of the land and such like that. But Luther and most Roman Catholics also, their solution to what they considered the Jewish problem was conversion. They wanted the Jews to become Christians. They wanted the Jews to convert. Hitler actually thought that that was the worst thing that could happen because he thought the Jews were a race, not a religion. He didn't want them to convert to Christianity because he thought that that would allow them to bring their bad genes, what he saw as their negative bad heredity, into the German gene pool by intermarrying with Germans and being accepted into the German community. Next slide, please. So here is a here is a picture of a that was in a Nazi textbook. So it's part of Nazi propaganda to the young people. And here you have a Jew standing there in the middle with that black coat on, and he has in his hands a Bible probably a Bible. It has a cross, a book with a cross on it, so probably a Bible or hymnal, probably a Bible. Then he also a set of rosary beads, so he's coming out of a Catholic church, presumably. And here, the caption to this cartoonish figure says, "Baptism did not make him a non-Jew." And so the idea is, biologically, he's still a Jew. And to Hitler, that's all that mattered. What's the biology? He thought everything was about race, everything was about biology. And so just sprinkling them in baptism doesn't change them. As far as Hitler was concerned, he was still a Jew. And that's, by the way, why in the Holocaust, the Nazis killed uh, Jews, no matter what their religion was. They killed Jews who'd become atheists. They killed Jews who had become Christians. They killed Jews who had converted. It didn't matter to Hitler what religion they were of. He was interested in what their racial makeup was. But you also notice in this uh, piece of Nazi propaganda that this Jewish figure is looking over toward those young German girls. And so the idea here is that he is lusting after them. And this is supposed to be sort of a warning to Germans about the Jewish immorality and the fact that they're still Jews, even if they are Catholics or Protestants or whatever, and that they still should be avoided and ultimately persecuted. So Hitler thought that the very worst thing that could happen would be the Jews would convert to Christianity, because then they would be accepted by the German racial community. Interestingly, Hitler also made very clear in many places in his writings, as well as in his speeches and his monologues, that he rejected the Old Testament because it was Jewish. That was very common among anti-Semitic thinkers of his time. And by the way, most of these ideas that I'm telling you about that Hitler embraced, many of these were embraced by anti-Semitic thinkers before Hitler. He was not really original in his thinking about these matters. These are ideas that he was taking from other anti-Semitic thinkers. He mixed his ideas from different sources. He didn't take them all from one person or something like that. There's no one person that was the guy that gave Hitler all of his ideas. But there were lots of anti-Semites who held similar kinds of ideas before Hitler. Uh, Hitler also rejected all of the Pauline epistles, which is about half of the New Testament, because he claimed that Paul was a Jewish rabbi who was smuggling Jewish ideas into the early forms of Christianity. Interestingly, however, Hitler did have a sort of positive view of Jesus. Whenever he talked about Jesus, although he didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God, he didn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, he didn't believe in Jesus as a important religious figure. He did think that Jesus was sort of a racial uh, hero because he thought that Jesus was an Aryan instead of being a Jew, because he thought Jesus was fathered by a Roman soldier. He didn't believe in the virgin birth. So he believed Jesus was fathered by an Aryan, and because of that, he had enough Aryan blood. And he thought that Jesus was an opponent of the Jews. And so Hitler's favorite Bible story was about Jesus driving the Jews out of the temple with a whip. And so he sees Jesus as a great Aryan fighter against the Jews, and so that's how how Hitler was going to interpret Jesus and see him as a great hero. Now, he didn't think that he rose from the dead. He thought that he was a martyr. He was killed by the Jews ultimately, but Hitler didn't believe that he rose from the dead or anything like that. Next slide, please. And I'm not sure if this is why Hitler posed with the whip in this particular photo that was taken of him, but I think he is. There certainly were a lot of places where Hitler was trying to mimic Jesus and have this sort of messianic aura about him to try, and including in proclaiming his 1,000-year Reich, which Reich means empire or kingdom. And in fact, in the Lord's Prayer, the way they pray, "Your kingdom come," is "Dein Reich komme." So Reich can mean kingdom, and so Hitler is trying to pose his 1,000-year kingdom is supposed to be like the millennium, right? So the biblical millennium. So Hitler did try to pose like Jesus in many cases, and did think Jesus was a great figure, but he thought that Christianity had completely corrupted anything that Jesus had taught, and so he didn't believe in Christianity. And that gets me to the next question then about, was Hitler a Christian? Well, Hitler sometimes did pose as a Christian. In the 1919 party program, 25-point program, Hitler espoused what was called positive Christianity. And a favorite quote of atheists comes from 1922 in one of his speeches, where Hitler, early on in his political career, said, quote, "My Christian feeling directs me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter." And what's interesting about this is that, Hitler is a politician in the 1920s trying to gain public support. And so he's saying things to pander to the people. He's a savvy politician. But what's interesting is that atheists, when they take these statements from the 1920s, before Hitler was even in power, where Hitler is claiming to make these connections with Christianity, they basically take the attitude of Hitler said it, I believe it, and that settles it. So if Hitler said it, it must be true. Hitler must have been telling us the truth then. Although, of course, Hitler lied constantly about all sorts of issues, and we can get into that later if you want to. But obviously, Hitler was a liar in many respects, and we could bring out many cases of that. Obviously, the peace treaties that he signed, like with the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and his Concordat with the Vatican, I'll actually talk more about that in just a little bit. Hitler was constantly lying about things, and so the fact that he would say that he was, you know, positive toward Christianity is not really to be believed, unless we can show from evidence that he did actually hold these beliefs in private and in other kinds of ways. And the and in fact, the opposite is the case. What we find out in private, and it also even sometimes maybe in public, Hitler did distance himself from Christianity. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But let me give just another example. And my slide's already up here. But this slide that I have up here is another example of Hitler trying to, make himself look like a Christian symbol here. This is from a book by his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. And Hoffmann took this photo of Hitler leaving the Marienkirche in Wilhelmshaven. And the caption to the photo says, "A photographic chance event becomes a symbol. Adolf Hitler, the supposed heretic, leaving the Marienkirche in Wilhelmshaven." And here you have this cross, this white cross, very bright above Hitler's head, giving him sort of this halo kind of effect. And so the caption is trying to make clear that Hitler's not really a heretic. He's a supposed heretic. So he's not really a heretic. And he's coming out of a church here, after all. So you get the idea. He must have attended a church service while he was in Wilhelmshaven. This photo actually adorned the cover of a book that came out a few years back. Give me the next slide, please. Of Richard Stikeman Gall, who wrote a book called The Holy Reich, where he tried to show that there was a good deal of Christianity within Nazi circles, including Hitler himself. In fact, interestingly, that's where I figured out this issue that I'm going to tell you in just a little bit about that photo, because there's a very interesting thing about that particular photo. But before I get to that, let me point out that there's a problem with viewing Hitler as a Christian, despite the fact that publicly he did proclaim himself to be that on several occasions. The problem is really twofold with this evidence. First of all, Hitler often distanced himself from Christianity and even criticized it, especially in private. So if you look at his private conversations, as they've been reported to us sometimes in diaries like Himmler's diaries and Goebbels' diaries, or sometimes by his secretary after the fact writing her memoirs, or by the people recording different things that Hitler had said, he very very often makes very negative comments about Christianity, making clear he was not supportive of it. And secondly, Hitler and his regime persecuted Christianity in various ways and tried to undermine its influence. So let me hit on both of those points. Firstly, Hitler distancing himself from and criticizing Christianity, especially in private. Well, this photo by Heinrich Hoffmann plays a key role here, interestingly, because in 1938, Heinrich Hoffmann republished his book of photos, but in this case, the photo looked a little different. Next slide, please. So the original photo on the left, and by the way, that is the original photo, and I have not seen it for myself, but I wrote to the archivist in Munich, where Heinrich Hoffmann's photos are, and the archivist there not only looked at the photos there, but he also looked at the negatives. They actually have the negatives of this photo, and he looked at the negatives and told me that the cross is in the negative. So this is the original photo on the left as it was taken. However, in the 1938 edition of the book, what you see is the photograph on the right. And so the cross has been airbrushed out of this photo. So trying to take away that Christian symbolism from Hitler. By 1938, Hitler was firmly in power. He didn't need the public support as much as he had earlier. But in 1932, he was not in power yet. So he's wanting to try to gain more public support. And so in 1938, he's sort of able to lay his cards out on the table a little bit more. And he doesn't want to be associated with Christianity as much as he had been earlier. And so the airbrushes. And by the way, this is the only photograph, and I've contacted quite a number of Nazi historians. This is the only photograph that anyone knows about that's been altered by Hitler and the Nazis during the Nazi period to try to change perceptions of something. Now, Stalin did it all the time. Stalin airbrushed pictures to get Trotsky out of photos and other kinds of things like that. But in the Nazi case, this is the only photo we know of where Hitler actually had it doctored to try to change it. Not only did they change the photo, but they also had to change the caption. So here's the new caption. Adolf Hitler after sightseeing at the historic Marienekirche in Wilhelmshaven. So the idea in this caption is Adolf Hitler, he's not going to church. He's not attending a church service. He's sightseeing there. So again, trying to distance himself from the Christian church in this case as well. This is only a very this is a very interesting example, but only one of many examples of times where Hitler was going to come out negatively toward Christianity. In fact, interestingly, from Hitler's very young years as a young man, all the evidence suggests that he was alienated from Christianity from a very young age. His godfather actually claimed that when Hitler was confirmed in the Catholic Church, which he was, that Hitler was disgusted by the confirmation ceremony. And so from that time on, Hitler really never had any affinities toward the Catholic Church. He never attended worship services once he was old enough to leave home and once he was an adult, except for a few marriages and baptisms and sort of special services for other people. But he never attended the regular church services ever in his life. As a boy he did, but as a man he never did. When he had opportunity, he never did. And he also spoke negatively about Christianity, not only privately, yes, privately, but also sometimes even publicly. So in an August 1920 speech, for example, Hitler accused the Jews of using Christianity to destroy the Roman Empire. So here he's claiming that Christianity is a tool of the Jews. Obviously, that's a negative slam on Christianity. And he's claiming that Christianity destroyed the Roman Empire, which he thought of very highly. And this theme is repeated in many of Hitler's speeches and monologues. Hitler also, in his speeches, accused Paul of being a Jewish rabbi who used Christianity to try to form a communist movement. And so he saw primitive Christianity as being a form of communism, which obviously is negative in Hitler's eyes. While Hitler was in prison in 1924, there were some of his colleagues who were holding a conversation relating to religion, and Hess, who became Hitler's private secretary later on, and who was very closely associated already with Hitler, who was in the prison with Hitler. Hitler told Hess that he had to camouflage his negativity and criticism toward Christianity because he knew it wasn't it wouldn't be a good political move. And in fact, interestingly, in Mein Kampf, his book that he began writing while he was in prison, he actually mentions that there was an Austrian politician who was fairly prominent in Austria while he was living there before 1913, named Georg von Schörnerer. And he said that Schörnerer's biggest political mistake was to start a campaign against the Catholic Church. Hitler thought very highly of Georg von Schirner because Schirner was the leader of the Pan-German Party, and Hitler was very uh, supportive of Pan-German nationalism, like Schirner was. Schirner was also anti-Semitic, and so Hitler thought highly of Schirner's ideology, but he thought Schirner had messed up tactically by attacking the Catholic Church. And so Hitler vowed that he was not going to do that, at least not overtly. But interestingly, Hitler still does, on occasion, still make negative comments about Christianity, even publicly, even in Mein Kampf. In the second volume of Mein Kampf, which he wrote right after he got out of prison, he said this about Christianity, and here I'm quoting. Hitler said, quote, "A philosophy filled with infernal intolerance will only be broken by a new idea, driven forward by the same spirit, championed by the same mighty will, and at the same time pure and absolutely genuine in itself." And he continued, "The individual may establish with pain today that with the appearance of Christianity, the first spiritual terror entered into the far freer ancient world. But he will not be able to contest the fact that since then, the world has been afflicted and dominated by this coercion. He's talking here about Christianity. The world's been afflicted by Christianity, and he says that this and that coercion, meaning the coercion of Christianity, that coercion is broken only by coercion, and terror only by terror. Only then, Hitler said, can a new state of affairs be constructively created. So here, Hitler calls Christianity the first spiritual terror and talks about using terror tactics to try to destroy it ultimately. So that's one way that Hitler was going to sort of express his negativity, even in Mein Kampf, even publicly in Mein Kampf in his book. Another way, next slide, please, is in a book of photographs by Hoffman. In fact, I think this is from the same one that that was with those other photo I showed you about him coming out of the church in Wilhelmshaven. Another photo of Hitler shows Hitler across from the statue of Friedrich Nietzsche. This is a picture of Hitler visiting the Nietzsche archive. Hitler contributed money to the Nietzsche archive and did associate with Nietzsche, such as in this particular photo. Nietzsche, of course, was famous for his dictum that God is dead. Now, Hitler did not believe God is dead, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. But still, Hitler did think very highly of Nietzsche and of Nietzsche's will to power philosophy and such. And certainly he's willing to be associated with Nietzsche, despite the fact that Nietzsche was atheistic. Again, Hitler was not atheistic. And again, I'll get to that in just a little bit. Also, if we think privately, Goebbels and Rosenberg in their diaries comment quite a bit about Hitler's opposition to Christianity and different comments that Hitler makes negatively toward Christianity. Hitler also bashed Christianity quite frequently in his monologues during World War II. And here I need to say just a little bit about the monologues because there's some misinformation going on around that. The English language edition of the monologues is based upon faulty manuscripts and is possibly fraudulent. However, what many atheists and skeptics who criticize Hitler as being Christian and claim that he didn't make these comments about negativity toward Christianity don't realize is that there are bona fide German editions. And since I can read German, I've read both of those different editions. There's one edited by Werner Jochmann, another is edited by Henry Picker. Both of those editions are considered fairly reliable. In fact, they both overlap considerably. And historians do consider those reliable renditions of what Hitler was saying to his colleagues in the bunker during the war. And Himmler actually had these transcribed had secretaries in there transcribing these things while they were being said. So that's why we have transcriptions of these monologues that Hitler was saying. But in these monologues, Hitler very often bashed Christianity. And just to give you one example of this, on December 13th, 1941, Hitler mocked Christian teachings such as the fall, the virgin birth, redemption through the death of Jesus. And then he stated, and here's one of the key points, and this is just one, again, this is just part of a longer time where he's criticizing Christianity. He said, Christianity is the most insane thing that a human brain in its delusion has ever brought forth, a mockery of everything divine. And so here's Hitler talking in private to colleagues that he's trying to convince of his own ideology and his own perspective. And he certainly uh, bashes and assaults Christianity, in fact. And in fact, if you look at Hitler's colleagues and associates who were with him during this time, too, they uniformly claim in their memoirs that Hitler rejected Christianity. Hitler's secretary, for example, claimed that he attacked Christianity frequently during this time as well. So all the evidence we have about Hitler's own personal views points to the fact that he was not embracing Christianity. Secondly, another key point that I brought out earlier that I want to develop now is that Hitler persecuted Christianity while he was in power. Now, he was cautious about this because he knew it was not popular to attack Christianity frontally and to try to just tear it down and destroy it completely. And so he was cautious in his attempt to, because he didn't want to alienate Germans, but he did try to bring the churches under control, especially at first. So what Hitler did at the very early phases in the summer of 1933, he came to power in end of January 1933, is he forced the Protestant church to unite under a single Reich bishop, and that was an innovation. And Hitler was able to influence the church elections. He even gave a radio address. He wasn't even a Protestant, but he gave a radio address supporting this Protestant uh, Ludwig Müller to be elected as the Reich bishop. And in the church elections, he was elected. Interesting, it kind of backfired on Hitler, however, because Müller's policies were going to split the Protestant church and didn't win. Müller wasn't able to win over the entire Protestant church to his position. Müller was an anti-Semite himself. He was very pro-Nazi in many ways, just like a small wing of the Protestant church was at that time. With the Catholic Church, Hitler negotiated a Concordat, which is a treaty with the Vatican. And that Concordat was going to claim that Catholics would not be allowed to participate in politics as Catholics. That is, I mean, they still could do all the other things any other German citizen could do, but they couldn't participate as Catholic politicians, as Catholic political parties. That Hitler shut down the Center Party, which was a Catholic political party, in the summer of 1933. And then Hitler pledged in the Concordat that he was going to allow the Catholic Church to run their youth organizations, to appoint their leaders, and also to operate their Catholic schools. However, after signing the Concordat in the summer of 1933, Hitler continually infringed on the Concordat. They banned Catholic youth organizations. They closed Catholic schools. Give me my next slide, please. Here's a Nazi poster that says Adolf Hitler's Youth. Okay, so the Hitler Youth, of course, was an organization that everyone was supposed to come to, but Adolf Hitler's Youth, and then he says, go to public school. So Adolf Hitler's youth aren't supposed to go to private schools, and Catholic schools were the most prominent private schools in Germany, most numerous at the time. So they're supposed to go to public school because the Nazis want to be able to indoctrinate them in Nazi ideology at the public schools rather than have them go to Catholic school. The Nazis also, over the course of the 1930s and early 40s, were going to close monasteries, Catholic monasteries. By 1937, so just 4 years after the Concordat had been signed, the Vatican had sent 70 letters of protest to the Nazi government over violations of the Concordat. And then in 1937, the Pope finally went public and issued an encyclical opposing the Nazi infringements on the Concordat. So Hitler was trying to whittle away at the Catholic Church as well as the Protestant Church influences at the time. Interestingly, when Germany annexed Austria in 1938 and then annexed parts of Poland in 1939, they claimed that they were not even under the Concordat, and so they didn't even bother to try to keep the Concordat in those territories. In terms of the Protestant Church, there was a wing of the Protestant Church that rebelled against Hitler's policies, especially the policy of trying to get Jewish converts out of pastoral positions. There were about 50, if I recall correctly, something like that anyway, several dozen uh, pastors in the Protestant church who had been Jews who had converted to Protestantism, or perhaps their parents had, uh, and the Nazi regime opposed them being pastors, and so a wing of the Protestant church broke off called the Confessing Church. And in 1937, the Nazi regime jailed hundreds of uh, confessing church pastors, some of whom later were executed uh, during the Nazi regime. Another way that Hitler tried to combat Christianity while he's in power was to try to de-Christianize various Christian festivals, such as Christmas. Hitler's press chief testified that Hitler hated Christmas. And so he would usually go out driving that day to just to get away from everything. And interestingly, during the Nazi period, the last several years of the Nazi period, there were Christmas books that the Nazi regime published. Uh, and these Christmas books did not even mention Jesus or say anything about religion, or certainly not about the Christian religion. So they were trying to get people focused on, the Christmas tree, the old Germanic customs relating to Christmas, and try to get their minds off of the Christian significance of Christmas. So they were spreading Nazi ideology instead. And interestingly, this slide that I have up here shows you a photo from right at the beginning of one of those Christmas books, and it has a quotation from Adolf Hitler at the bottom of it that says, "All of nature is a violent struggle between strength and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak." That's not exactly Silent Night. So again, they're trying to portray their ideology of struggle, racial struggle, the Darwinian struggle for existence between races, and in trying to portray those kind of issues as prominent, and demote Christianity at that time. Another interesting way that Hitler tried to persecute Christianity was during World War II. Hitler ordered the chaplains, so Catholic and Protestant chaplains, on the Eastern Front be placed in the heat of battle. This was actually nicknamed, even at the time, the Uriah Law. And Uriah was the person, of course, who David had murdered in that way by putting him in the front of the battle, and so that David could take Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. And so Hitler very forthrightly is trying to kill off the chaplains by getting them killed in battle, not by personally killing them, but by getting them killed in battle. Interestingly, the German Air Force, which had been formed by the Nazis, it was under Goering's control, they didn't even have chaplains. And so they were the segment of the armed forces that was most under Nazi control, because Goering controlled them, and because they'd only been formed. Under the Versailles Treaty, the Germans hadn't been able to form an air force before the Nazis came along and violated the Versailles Treaty. Finally, there's another interesting way that Hitler tried to persecute churches. That is that when Hitler was making plans for rebuilding the German cities after World War II, so while the war was going on, the German cities are being bombed. Hitler still thinks he's going to win. He has his architects put together these elaborate plans for rebuilding the German cities. And interestingly, these new urban developments that were supposed to be built after the war had no churches in them, making again very clear that Hitler was trying to undermine the church. And he specifically stipulated that no churches would be rebuilt after World War II that were destroyed unless they were architectural treasures and sort of needed to be preserved for their architectural prominence and such. So again, I could give lots of other evidence of this too, and I'll get to the Postlingberg here, just a bit here. But if Hitler was not a Christian, then you might ask, well, then what was he? What did he believe? Well, I want to say, first of all, some people think, well, Hitler was an atheist. No, Hitler wasn't an atheist either. And so Hitler does make a lot of comments criticizing atheism, which he associated with the communists and such. So there's really no evidence that Hitler was an atheist. He never proclaimed himself to be an atheist, even privately. He does seem to believe in some kind of a higher power or a god of some sort in all of his talking, including his private conversations. So there's no real evidence that Hitler was an atheist. Also, Hitler rejected occultism. Some people think, well, Hitler was an occultist. He was into the occult. No, Hitler wasn't really into the occult either. Some Nazis were. Himmler, Rosenberg, Hess. They were into the occult. But Hitler was not, nor was Goebbels, and nor was Heydrich, and nor were some other high-ranking Nazi officials. Hitler actually rejected occultism, and Hitler would actually make negative comments about occultism behind Himmler and Hess's backs and such, and he derided their beliefs. And in fact, interestingly, when Hess in May 1941 flew to Scotland to try to broker a deal with the British to try to get them out of the war because he knew about Hitler's plans to attack the Soviet Union the following month. Hitler claimed that Hess had gone mad, and Hitler immediately ordered the arrest of astrologers throughout Germany. And so Himmler went out and rounded up the astrologers because Hitler blamed them for Hess's departure and such. He thought they'd driven him mad and such. So what was he? If he wasn't a Christian, if he wasn't an atheist, if he wasn't an occultist, well, then what was he? Well, I think the closest we can come to what Hitler was is probably he was a pantheist. A pantheist is a person that believes that nature is God. And there's a lot of evidence to show that Hitler did believe that nature was God. So let me give you just a few examples of this. One of them is this church, Purslingberg, comes down to that in Linz, Austria. Linz is where Hitler grew up, so he was very familiar with Linz, and he knew about this church sitting up above the city there, which was a pilgrimage church. Hitler, in his monologues, said that he wanted to destroy the Purslingberg church and build a planetarium on that site. Now, why would he want to do that? Well, he wants to destroy Christianity, but he wants to build a planetarium because he thought that people should observe the cosmos. They should see nature, in other words. And here's what he said, the lesson that he thought people should learn from going to this planetarium. He said, quote, "A person can comprehend this and that, but he cannot dominate nature. He must know that he is a being dependent on the creation." Now, notice he said he's a being dependent on the creation, not on the creator, but a being dependent on the creation, which suggests that nature itself is over us and ruling over us. And so this is one line of evidence showing that Hitler deified nature. Hitler's personal secretary, while he was in the last several years, Christa Schroeder, not the Nazi party officials, just a woman secretary of his who would record, his letters and different things. Christa Schroeder wrote some memoirs after World War II was over, and here's what she said about Hitler. She said, quote, "He," meaning Hitler, "considered the Christian religion an outdated, hypocritical, and human ensnaring institution. His religion was the laws of nature." So Schroeder certainly thought that Hitler was a pantheist, that he was following the laws of nature rather than Christianity. Interestingly, if you look at the book Mein Kampf, Hitler's only book that he actually published, he published it in 2 volumes. He actually wrote another book called that's just known as the second book because he never actually published it and it never had a title. But in Mein Kampf, interestingly, the translators of Mein Kampf capitalize nature because the translators recognize that Hitler is personifying and even deifying nature in those cases. Now, in the original German, Natur is always capitalized as a noun. All nouns in German are capitalized. So we don't know if Hitler would have taken that approach. But obviously, the translators thought that Hitler was personifying and even deifying nature. And Hitler uses terms in Mein Kampf like the will of nature, suggesting that nature is something more than just inert. And in many places in Mein Kampf, when he's talking about God, he often conflates God and nature. Let me give you an example. It's one of the most famous passages from Mein Kampf, especially in this debate over Hitler's embrace of Christianity. Hitler said in Mein Kampf, quote, "Hence today, I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord." And some people will say, well, look, there Hitler's taking a Christian position. Claims that fighting the Jews is doing the work of the Lord, so he must be a Christian. But interestingly, if you read the context of that statement, you'll find out he's not really talking about Jesus or Christianity even when he's talking about God. So just above that, just a couple sentences above that statement, he said, quote, "Eternal nature inexorably avenges the infringement of her commands." Now notice he called nature eternal there, eternal nature. That means it wasn't created. That means there was no creator God like Christianity and Judaism teaches. So he says nature is eternal. And then he also says eternal nature inexorably avenges the infringement of her commands. So it talks about nature making commands. Thus nature is in control of morality. And indeed, I wrote an entire book called Hitler's Ethic, where I look at the way that Hitler embraced evolutionary ethics and thought that, you know, uh, pr- uh, promoting the evolutionary struggle and the evolutionary progress was what was moral. What is morally good is making things biologically better, improving things biologically. What's morally bad is, leading to biological decline and such. And this is illustrated very clearly in my next slide, which will be my last slide here for today, which looks at a poster that was used in Nazi biology classes. And this poster said at the top of the poster, it said, "Elimination of the sick and weak in nature." And then you see these pictures of a raptor with a dead hare that it had killed that it's going to eat. And then you have a man chopping down a sickly tree. And then it says underneath the poster, the bottom of the poster says, "Whatever cannot withstand the demands of existence is destroyed." Now, what's interesting about this poster is that, for one thing, this was actually put in place in the mid 1930s. And they claimed that this was supposed to be justifying their sterilization campaign. The Nazis had introduced compulsory sterilization for people with disabilities. And so the idea is that this is in line with nature. So it's showing this is but what's interesting is that this is actually, in this poster, is actually showing death to the so-called unfit or the sick or weak in nature. That is, the hare gets killed by the raptor. The man is chopping down the tree, killing the tree that's already pretty much dead, almost dead anyway. But it's bringing death to it. And so it's not surprising that the Nazis in 1939 to 40 then introduced their euthanasia program, where they actually did kill people with disabilities. So Hitler began killing people with disabilities based on this social Darwinist idea that the people with disabilities are unfit. They're the sick and the weak in nature that this poster is talking about. And so they think it's legitimate to destroy them so that they can improve the human species and try to make things better. So ultimately, Hitler, in my view, was a pantheist, or very close to a pantheist, who was embracing the Darwinian struggle for existence between races, and saw the Holocaust ultimately as one way to try to improve the human species by getting rid of what he thought were unfit racial types, that is, the Jews, the Gypsies, and of course the Nazis also killed millions of Slavs. There actually was a pamphlet that the SS put out during World War II called Der Untermensch, and Untermensch means subhuman. And actually, they were not talking about the Jews there; they were talking about Slavs in that context. The cover photo of it shows not Soviet POWs, so Slavs as the subhumans too. So the Nazis saw anyone who was non-Aryan or non-Nordic, and those terms were used. Aryan and Nordic were used to mean the same thing. Uh, Anyone who was not Nordic or not Aryan was considered subhuman, and thus could be killed, and that they thought would bring about ultimate improvement. So for all of these reasons, it's very clear that Hitler was not a Christian. I think it made clear he's not an atheist, not an occultist, but was again a follower of the nature, and what he saw as being the ultimate in nature was the Darwinian struggle for existence between races. Thank you. This concludes my presentation here, and now we can go to some questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Weikart. I have several questions here for you. That was a great presentation, very informative, and hopefully we can unpack even more of the relevant information here with the questions I have for you. Before we jump into the meat and potatoes of those questions, I want to first and foremost ask you, how and why did you end up studying and specializing in World War II and in Hitler in particular, to the point where you wrote a book on his ethics and a book on his religion?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because actually, when I was in graduate school, I was focusing mostly on late 19th century European intellectual history, especially German intellectual history. And I wasn't really thinking about Hitler and the Nazis. I, of course, studied them in the course of studying European history and, you know, modern Germany and such like that. So I did study about the Nazis, but it wasn't something I was really wanting to pursue in any big way. For one thing, I thought that enough had already been written about the Nazis, and why get
Sure.
into it? You know, there's a lot of other things that I could get into that I thought were be more interesting at the time. But what happened is, after I finished my dissertation on socialist Darwinism, which looked at the way that socialists like Marx and Engels and others interpreted Darwinism, I began a research project that was dealing with the way that Darwinists in the late 19th century had interpreted ethics, because I noticed that Ernst Haeckel, who was the leading German Darwinist in the late 19th century, and others had tried to use evolutionary ethics to undermine and replace Christian ethics, as well as Kantian ethics and other kinds of ethics. So I was intrigued by that, and so I started doing this research project on evolutionary ethics. And as I did that, I found out a couple of things. One was that uh, a lot of the people who began pushing for evolutionary ethics began promoting eugenics, which is the idea that we need to breed better humans, essentially. They also some of them began promoting euthanasia as well as a radicalized form of eugenics. And I also started realizing that a lot of them were promoting scientific racism also at the same time, and militarism and other kinds of things. And so, as I began doing the study about evolutionary ethics, it started dawning on me that a lot of these people that I was studying about seemed to have ideas that were remarkably similar to Hitler's ideas. And so, when my book actually when I finally wrote my book, I actually did put a final chapter in it about Hitler. The book is called From Darwin to Hitler: Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany. And most of the book deals with the pre-World War I period, but then I do have a chapter on Hitler showing how his ideas pulled from many of those social Darwinist ideas and evolutionary ethics ideas before that time. And so after that, the most controversial part of my book was the link with Hitler, of course. And so that then led me to my next book on Hitler's ethic, where I showed in more detail, by spending an entire book looking at Hitler's views, examining Mein Kampf, his speeches, his second book, and many other things, and showing the way that he relied on evolutionary ethics as really a center point of his ideology. I mean, evolutionary ethics wasn't just some tangent of his ideology; it really was a central element of his ideology. So that got me into doing more on Hitler at that time as well. And then as I got doing that, then I got interested in Hitler's religion. So it sort of went along a flow. But I wasn't really interested in graduate school. I wasn't really thinking about going that direction. I sort of got pushed that way by seeing how these ideas about social Darwinism and evolutionary ethics fit into Nazi ideology.
It's always interesting to me how researchers and scholars begin researching one thing, and it's like, oh, this is going to be my bread and butter. And to your point, it ends up being something that seems like a slight tangent that they end up getting kind of pulled
Yeah,
into and doing a ton of research in.
yeah,
And surely, you're not the only one. I feel like I hear of this all the time, both in
sure.
just academia, but also like even in YouTube circles and stuff. So, well, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Well,
Now,
so
for the
it's actually the
rest,
way it should.
yeah,
It's actually. Let me say this. That's actually the way it should be too, because it means that you're discovering something as
yeah.
you're doing your work. You're not just doing what you're not just coming at it with a idea in front. When I came at, in fact, in looking at Hitler, I didn't start my research project trying to connect Darwin to Hitler. That's not how I
Yeah.
started my research project. I wasn't even thinking of Hitler when I began it, the research project. The reason I connected it to Hitler is because it just became so obvious as I did more and more of the studies that there's a connection here. Some people, I think that I probably started wanting to draw that connection. That's not the case at all.
No, and I appreciate you saying that, because to your point, right, as I'm hoping we'll get to unpack here, there's a lot of misconceptions that float around, and I'm happy that in times where it seems like a lot of this sort of misinformation about Hitler, whether it's him being called a Christian by non-Christians trying to impugn Christianity on behalf of Hitler, or whether it's by people that are being Nazi sympathizers online and trying to gin up support for him. It's always good to have people that have been looking at this for a long time. To be able to speak on it, and that's what I'm hoping that we can do with the rest of this Q&A. So what I've done is, like I mentioned to you prior, when I sent you these questions, is I actually went through some of the talking points that I see online from Nazi sympathizers who will claim that Hitler was a Christian, and I would like for us to go through some of these points, and for you to assess the arguments that are being put forth, and respond to them. And so, one argument that is put forth by those who believe Hitler was a Christian goes something like this: well, the Third Reich purposefully used a plethora of Christian imagery and phrases. The phrase Gott mit uns, probably butchered that, right? Or meaning God with us, was commonplace, as was the swastika as a type of cross, sometimes used right alongside the regular cross on propaganda, and even utilized on some Nazi church altars. Why would a government and ideology antithetical to Christianity employ so much of its imagery? And so, what would you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, the Gott mit uns part of it. The Gott mit uns was actually on the belt buckles of people in the German army long before the Nazis came to power. So it wasn't something the Nazis introduced during that time. The Nazis really didn't have a problem with the saying Gott mit uns either, though, because as I already suggested, they were not atheists. Many of them were pantheists or occultists or neo-paganists and such. Hitler himself was, I argue, a pantheist or close to a pantheist. So he believed in some kind of God, even though a vague idea of God. And so the idea of God with us doesn't really violate anything that he uh, has a problem with. Also, Hitler basically just left a lot of people alone in their religious ideology. He basically just said, let them believe what they want to believe as long as they follow me and keep my, as long as they keep my laws in the here and now. I don't care what they believe about the hereafter. Basically, he actually said that. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he actually did say that in a speech that he gave to some Hitler uh, leaders in training. There was a training school for Nazi leaders, and he basically said, let people believe what they want to believe about religion, as long as they, obey us here in the now and do what we say here. So Gott mit uns isn't really a problem for the Nazis, but they weren't the ones that introduced it. They weren't pushing it at the time. Interestingly, too, sort of along that line, too. Interestingly, although Hitler never withdrew from the Catholic Church, and by the way, the church in Germany, differently from the United States, the church in Germany is a state church. And in order to withdraw from the Catholic Church, you can't just stop attending or say you want out. You have to actually go down to the city hall, pay a fee, and withdraw from the Catholic or Protestant church or whatever church you want to withdraw from. Hitler never actually did that, probably mostly for political purposes. But he did actually allow Himmler and some other of his associates to withdraw from the Catholic Church. And Himmler did. Himmler withdrew from the Catholic Church, but he didn't, when he had to give his new religion, Himmler didn't identify himself as an atheist. He actually put down as his new religion, Gottgläubig, which literally means believer in God. So he believed in some kind of God, Gottgläubig, but he withdrew from the Catholic Church because he didn't believe in the Catholic, and he wanted to withdraw from Catholicism and a form of Christianity. And he didn't identify with the Protestant Church. He didn't want to join the Protestant Church either. So he's not identifying with Christianity at all. He's identifying just some vague idea of God there. So, the Gott mit uns wasn't really a big problem for the Nazis. That doesn't make you a Christian just to believe in God. There's all sorts of non-Christians that believe in God. The second one, though, more interestingly, is about the swastika. The swastika is not a type of cross, by the way. The swastika is an ancient symbol that was used thousands of years before the Nazis came on the scene. In fact, there's a very interesting thing that I found out when I went to a art museum in Cologne, Germany, many years ago, and that is that there is a place where the Allied bombers bombed next to the cathedral, and this art museum got built over it that shows the mosaic tile floor of a Roman villa. So this is almost 2,000 years old, maybe not quite 2,000 years old, maybe 1,800 years old. I'm not sure the exact time frame on it, but it's going to be at least 16 or 1,700 years old. It was adorned with swastikas in that tile thing. The Native Americans used the swastika. The ancient Indians in Asia used the swastika. The swastika was used prominently, and it is not a Christian symbol in the slightest. Now, it is true, though, that there were a group that was known as the German Christian movement. This was a minority group within the Protestant Church of Germany that was pro-Nazi, that was anti-Semitic, and that did use the swastika with the cross as a symbol. They usually put the cross inside of a symbol with swastika in it and such. But what's interesting about that, and what people who are going to use this as an argument as the Nazis promoting this don't realize, is that in the mid-1930s, the Nazis actually banned them from doing that. The Nazi regime banned them from using the cross with the swastika. And so the Nazis, this was not something the Nazi regime was pushing, using the cross with the swastika. They actually banned it. It was something that this group of Protestants that were pro-Nazi were using, called the German Christian movement, that were doing that. So it wasn't the Nazi regime's affinity for Christianity, but there were some people who were pro-Nazi who identified with Christianity. I should say this too at the same time, that Richard Stikeman Gall, in his book The Holy Reich, who tries to show the affinities with the Nazis and with Christianity, has also made clear, which is also clear from other studies I've seen as well, that those who were in the German Christian movement, who were pro-Nazi but also considered themselves Christian, generally were very liberal theologically. By liberal theologically, I mean they generally didn't believe in the miracles of the Bible. They didn't
Hmm.
believe the Bible was infallible. In fact, most of them actually rejected the entire Old Testament, just like Hitler did, as a Jewish text. And many of them rejected parts of the New Testament as well, if it wasn't convenient for their own particular ideology, just as many liberal Protestants did at that time.
Yeah, no, thank you for that response. Now, moving on to another argument, and this whole Q&A for people at home is just going to be, argument after argument that these people provide.
Yeah.
And so, similarly, online defenders of Hitler will often cite his public statements praising Christianity and speaking negatively of atheism and paganism as proof of Hitler's Christianity. I'm going to read 3 quotes here that I got from an article from one such person talking about this, Corey Mahler,
Mhm.
excommunicated former LCMS uh, 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 excommunicatee, I guess. And he says the following. Or he cites the following. This quote is from Hitler in a speech at Stuttgart in 1933, and it says the following quote. And now, Stadtpräsident Bowles says that Christianity and the Catholic faith are threatened by us. And to that charge, I can answer. In the first place, it is Christians and not international atheists who now stand at the head of Germany. I do not merely talk of Christianity. No, I also profess that I will never ally myself with the parties which destroy Christianity. If many wish today to take threatened Christianity under their protection, where, I would ask, was Christianity for them in these 14 years when they went arm in arm with atheism? No, never and at no time was greater internal damage done to Christianity than in these 14 years when a party, theoretically Christian, sat with those who denied God in one and the same government, end quote. Here's another 2 short quotes. The following one from Mein Kampf that says, quote, as far as this variety of folkish warriors, referring to neo-pagans, are concerned, I can only wish the National Socialist movement and the German people with all my heart. Lord, preserve us from such friends, and then we can easily deal with our enemies, end quote. And the final quote from a speech at Berlin from 1942 that is often produced says the following quote, "We are convinced that the people need and require this faith, Christianity. We have therefore undertaken to fight against the atheist movement, and that not merely with a few theoretical declarations. We have stamped it out." End quote. And so people produce quotes like these and many others. Corey Mahler's article has much more quotes than just these from public speeches and such. And these sorts of people will say, aha, why would Hitler speak so glowingly of Christianity and so negatively of atheism and paganism in public while scheming against Christianity in private? That sounds like a contradiction. And so, how would you contextualize these quotes and how would you respond to this argument?
Of course, it's a contradiction, and it's an outright lie. In fact, let's just call it what it is. Hitler was a politician; he was a liar. In fact, if you look at his statements in 1933 to 35 and even 36 about foreign policy, he made very clear that he was a man of peace. He was not going to launch a war. Should we believe him? Well, no, because if you look at what was going on privately, if you look at what he said to his generals, you'll find that he was telling them that he was going to prepare for war already. He was not a man of peace, despite the fact that he was saying that all the time. Okay, so you can't just believe something just because Hitler says it. And if we look at, and if what's interesting too is if you look at the the pro-Christian rhetoric that Hitler gives, the vast majority of it is from before he came to power. Most of it comes from before 1933 when he's needing more support from the German people. Now, one of these that you gave here was from a speech in 1933, and this is shortly after he had come to power. And he does there try to identify as a Christian. And notice he's contrasting himself with international atheists. By the way, what he means there is communists. He's talking there about the Communist Party and the social and the Marxists and such. That's what he means when he's talking about international atheists there. And so he's slamming communism and trying to put himself up in good light there and trying to curry favor with the people, gain greater popularity. Hitler knew what played well with the German public. And so he knew what would make him more popular among the German people. And so this is his way of doing that. What's interesting about the 1942 one that you read there, this is, of course, long after Hitler was already in power. It's also a public speech. But interestingly, there, he doesn't actually identify himself as a Christian. What he says is, we are convinced that the people need and require this faith. So he said, the German people need. So Hitler's like not saying that I need it. Hitler's not saying that he needs that faith. He's saying, yeah, the German people, they identify with that. They need it. So therefore, we're undertaking to fight against the atheists. And here again, he's talking primarily about the communists here at this time there. And says that not merely with a few theoretical declarations, we have stamped it out. So he says, we've gotten rid of the communist movement in Germany here. And so you Christians can support us, and come on board with us. So Hitler's positive statements about Christianity were all about politics. They were all about gaining political popularity with the German people. I dare anyone to try to find a private statement that Hitler ever made where he promoted Christianity or claimed that he was a Christian or claimed that he identified with Christianity. Every private statement we know about that Hitler ever made about Christianity was negative. Whether it's in Rosenberg's diaries, Goebbels' diaries, Himmler's diaries, Christa Schroeder's memoirs about Hitler, whether it's in the monologues, whether it's in wherever you get it, wherever you want to look. If you try to look for Hitler's or Rudolf Hess, his letters that I quoted earlier, Rudolf Hess, when he was in Landsberg already in 1924, Hitler very consistently in private always bashed Christianity when he was talking about Christianity. In public, yes, he would speak glowingly about Christianity at times if he thought it would gain him political support. But that's all it was about, getting political support. Hitler was a consummate politician. And again, Hitler did this in a lot of other avenues too, foreign policy, other things too. So this shouldn't be a surprise. So people that want to think that we can take Hitler at face value and just believe everything he says are incredibly naive when they're thinking that, because Hitler was doing all sorts of things secretly that he did not divulge publicly to the German people, and especially when it came to the annihilation of people during World War II. I mean, Hitler didn't publicly proclaim, that he was killing people with disabilities. In fact, it was a secret program. People eventually found out about it, but it was a secret program. They tried to keep it as secret as possible, but uh, they killed 200 to 300,000 people with disability, 200,000 in Germany, plus tens of thousands in other occupied territories as well. So Hitler was not a man of his word. He was not a man that kept his word at all. And so there's no reason for us to believe it just because he said it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that to me is just so incredibly uh, ironic, if not downright convenient, that a lot of the same sort of people online that will say like, "Oh, please, I don't believe the mainstream narrative about the Nazis in World War II. Oh, you're so gullible." And suddenly, to your point, right?
They
Then
believe
suddenly it's like, oh,
they believe
politicians
Hitler,
like Hitler, they would never lie. It's like what?
especially in
Like
public. Especially
yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
public.
yeah. Politicians never lie ever for political gain, right?
Right.
And it becomes a very sort of silly thing. And I mean, that's the case even today. All sorts of people claim that they're Christians, right? I mean, like even right now as we're recording this, right? Like Joe Biden claims to be a faithful Roman Catholic, and I think a lot of Roman Catholic friends would have a thing or two to say about even just that, right?
Yeah.
Politicians claim this sort of stuff all the
Sure.
time. And so, yeah, to your point,
Sure. Yeah.
I think we should trust all these independent accounts that people have, his closest friends, his secretaries, those people that know him, and kind of compare the way that he speaks in public with the way he speaks in private. And so, our next point here that Hitler apologists will often make is that they'll claim that the Weimar Republic was, in their using their words, incredibly degenerate, and that the Nazis set themselves in staunch opposition to the moral decay and degeneracy, taking actions to work against things like prostitution, bestiality, and other sinful practices. The Nazi book burnings by these people will often even be framed or excused as simply an extension of this doing away with degeneracy in the nation. Is this an accurate picture of the events that took place? And did Hitler lead these actions from a place of Christian charity or due to something else?
Yeah, he definitely did it due to something else. And that something else was something I talked about a little bit earlier, which was this notion of uh, evolutionary ethics. Hitler believed that morality should be determined by whatever will produce the highest amount of evolutionary progress, and so whatever will promote biological well-being and such, improve the DNA. They didn't know about DNA back then, but improve the heredity, the genetics of people. That's good, and whatever demotes that is bad. And so there were a lot of places in which he did agree with Christianity, that there were certain things that he thought were negative. He thought that marriage and the family were a wonderful thing because he thought that was the best way to get as many healthy German babies as possible. But interestingly, during the war, Himmler talked with Hitler about introducing polygamy after the war because so many young men were being killed on the Eastern Front. And Hitler uh, expressed his view that he thought that might be a good thing to do then. Also, the SS during World War II began promoting uh, extramarital sexual relations if it was between an Aryan and could produce, good biological babies for the Third Reich. And so there was a lot of the Nazi regime was promoting sexual immorality, what the Christian church would call sexual immorality, because of their evolutionary ethics. So Hitler's evolutionary ethic did jive with the Christian perspective in a lot of ways, and Hitler played those up to try to gain support of the population, most of which identified as Christian. About a third was Roman Catholic, about two-thirds was Protestant. But he had other really goals in mind. And of course, Hitler himself committed sexual immorality. He never married until the very last day of his life, the woman that he was having an affair with. And he had affairs before that time, too, by the way. Uh, so uh, Hitler was not some uh, in his promotion of morality, his morality did not uh, align perfectly with Christian morality, but he played up the ways that it did, and did try to come out against things. Okay, so the things like you mentioned, like prostitution, other things like that, homosexuality, bestiality, he opposed those things because they wouldn't produce as much. He didn't think that that was the way to produce healthy German babies, and he wanted to produce as many healthy German babies as possible. So homosexuality doesn't produce babies. He wants babies. So he opposes homosexuality on that basis, not because Christianity said homosexuality is wrong, but because he wanted as many German healthy babies as possible. So there were ways in which their ideas aligned, but they weren't the same. And that with the book burnings that Hitler took place, the book burnings was not primarily about burning books that were considered, sleazy or pornographic or something like that. Most of the books that were burned in the book burnings were books that were either written by Jews or by Marxists. There were also some modernists that they tossed to the flames as well, because Hitler didn't like modernist art of any sort. And so modernist art was also trashed by the Nazis in many ways. But I mean, you look at the Nazi uh, realistic kind of sculptures and such. And there's a lot of nudes, by the way, there among them too. So they're not just promoting, some prude kind of morality in their artwork either, even when they are trying to get rid of the modernist kinds of art.
Mm. So, in order to try to excuse Hitler's invasion of Poland, Nazi apologists will try to appeal to filial affections between kinsmen and say that Hitler was simply trying to rescue his fellow Germans in Poland from mistreatment by the Poles against ethnic Germans who were there since the territory had been taken from Germany in World War I. Some of these online characters will say that Hitler was not invading a neighbor, but was simply protecting his brother, as would be his Christian duty. How would you respond to this claim?
Well, for one thing, the area of Poland that was had been part of Germany and had a German ethnic population in it in 1939 when Hitler invaded was only a very small part of Poland. So it wouldn't have necessitated him taking over all of Poland. He just had to take a small part of it if he's about protecting his Germans. But interestingly, uh, there's an interesting book called Hitler Strikes Poland, in which uh, the historian details that before the Nazis went into Poland, they drew up a list of 61,000 people whom they wanted murdered. And they sent in Einsatzgruppen. These were commando units that were organized. They were either SS units or police units that were sent in behind the regular army, who were supposed to round up these 61,000 people and execute them in cold blood. I mean, just murder them in cold blood. These were Catholic priests. These were Polish intellectuals. These were trade union leaders. These were Marxists. These were also a few prominent Jews. And ultimately, they did kill 50,000. These Einsatzgruppen did kill
Hmm.
50,000 people. These were not people who were a threat to the German population, in the western parts of Poland. Hitler and people who say this, that's just about rescuing the Germans, do not understand Hitler's ideology at all, because Hitler's ideology, his idea of social Darwinism that I detail in a lot of that I go into a lot of detail in my book Hitler's Ethic. Hitler believed that there's a racial struggle going on. And he thought that the German population was expanding faster than its food supply. That, by the way, was basically what Darwin had taught, that the populations, biological populations, tend to expand faster than their food supplies. And he wanted the German population to expand faster because he thought they were the master race. So he thought they needed more territory. And so he thought they needed what was called living space. The German word is Lebensraum. Sometimes you'll see that Lebensraum or living space. So Hitler's philosophy of expansionism was built into this idea of living space. And the idea of living space is that we need more agricultural land to feed the growing German population, and we need to expand into these other areas to do that. So it's not just about, so Hitler's expansion into Poland was not just about rescuing his fellow Germans. And by the way, if you go back to his book Mein Kampf, and especially his second book, both of those make this very clear, that he's wanting to take over territories in the East in order to take over agricultural lands that can then feed a growing German population. But that means he has to get rid of other populations that he considers these inferior races. So he thought the Slavs, as well as the Jews, and there were 3 million Jews in Poland at the time that he took it over, uh, and then another 3 million in the Soviet Union once he took it over. He needs to push Slavs out of those territories. And the Germans drew very forthright plans to try to depopulate some of these areas of Poland and of the Soviet Union, and to move German settlers into those areas. In fact, they set up a whole corridor going from Germany through Poland to the Black Sea. There was supposed to be a corridor of German settlement that was supposed to then expand later on to take over all those territories. So this expansionist effort was not just about, rescuing some fellow Germans. It was about expanding German space by driving out people that were considered inferior races. And again, Hitler makes this very clear in Mein Kampf. He makes this very clear in his second book as well as in a lot of speeches that he gave during World War II. He gave a number of speeches to generals and to other Nazi party leaders where he was a little more open about his worldview and what he was trying to accomplish in the war. And he makes it very clear. It's also very clear if you read some of the Nazi worldview pamphlets that were put out. There was a worldview pamphlet that was put out for the military for training. There was the SS put out pamphlets like this to try to inculcate the Nazi worldview in SS units and such. And these make very clear that this campaign against Poland, and then by the way, he also went against the Soviet Union. Why did he go against the Soviet Union then? If going into Poland is just about rescuing Germans, where were the Germans in the Soviet Union? Well, there were actually a few Germans in the Soviet Union, but not that many. He certainly wasn't going after them when he invaded the Soviet Union. He was trying to gain living space at that time. Of course, he wanted to destroy the communist government as well. He hated communism, but it also was about gaining living space, and that was always clear in Hitler's view, and as he made it clear to many of his associates.
Another claim that Hitler apologists will make is the idea that Hitler was incredibly friendly toward the German churches and that he even allocated significant funding to the building of those churches. They will even appeal to the German census during the Third Reich, crediting the Nazi Party with temporarily halting the collapse of Christianity in Germany. They will argue that a fundamentally anti Christian leader and party would not have done these things, thus implicating Hitler as a Christian by result. How would you respond to that claim?
Well, the first claim about him allocating significant funding to the building of churches is kind of spurious because, again, the German church was a state run church before Hitler came to power. So they already were getting funding from the state to do these things. Hitler didn't increase funding to build more churches. And that's what it seems to imply, that Hitler was sort of giving more funding to the churches than had been given earlier. That is not the case. The government still was allowing funding to go to the churches, just like it had earlier. He didn't want to rile up the German people any more than he had to. But he wasn't increasing their funding and giving more funding to building churches. And interestingly, as I told you earlier in my talk, when Hitler laid plans for rebuilding Germany after World War II, Hitler made very clear he did not want churches in the German cities. And so he's doing exactly just the opposite. And actually, during World War II, they also did other things too that I didn't mention. So, for example, they shut down Protestant and Catholic periodicals. They shut them. They claimed there wasn't enough paper. They claimed there was a paper shortage and everything, but they shut down their periodicals. They didn't shut down Nazi periodicals, of course. Nazi journals were still able to publish, but the Protestants and the Catholics were not allowed to publish their magazines during World War II. So there were all sorts of ways that Hitler was trying to undermine the churches. He wasn't friendly toward the churches in the slightest. In this way, the only way he was friendly toward them is that he tried not to rile up the Germans any more than he had to, and he realized that could be a sore point. And in fact, interestingly, there's an interesting book by Nathan Stoltzfus called Hitler's Compromises, and in that book he shows that Hitler did on occasion compromise when there were unpopular policies, especially that some of his underlings undertook, and a lot of it did have to do with religion. So, for example, when a Nazi official once removed crucifixes from a school in one region. The people protested very strongly, and ultimately the Nazi regime backed down and said, "Okay, you can have your crucifixes back, in the schools." When the Nazis put a Protestant bishop, under house arrest, the people poured out in the streets. There were street protests. People don't realize this, but there were
Mm.
street protests during the Nazi period against the Nazi regime, and sometimes over religion. In this case, when the Protestant bishop was put under house arrest, there were street protests. And finally, Hitler backed down and allowed the bishop to uh, re- to take over his functions and everything again. So Hitler sometimes was, quote, friendly in sense like that when he knew that he needed popularity from the German people, and when he knew that it was unpopular what he was doing there. In terms of the uh, German census, I'm not familiar with that, although I'd be very surprised if there was a German census that showed a recovery of Christianity during the Third Reich. Certainly within the Nazi Party, there were people who were withdrawing from the Christian churches to declare themselves Gottgläubig, like Himmler and others, especially in the SS, did. Uh, they may not have declined as fast during the Nazi period as they did in the 1920s, but that's probably just because by the 1920s there was just a much faster decline of Christianity. By that time, most of the people who were not interested in Christianity had already withdrawn, I'm guessing. But I don't know enough about that census to know what the details are.
Oh, sorry. One sec. You cut out there for a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh, just one sec. The storm right outside my window has picked up again, so my internet is all right. There we go. I think I can see you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. All right, yeah, I can see you now. You're back. I heard everything that you said. I just you cut out there once you were done for a second. So one final argument, and honestly, the most, in my opinion, the most desperate and grasping at straws of them all. Although I think there are several competitors for that for that title here. That Nazi apologists make online is the idea that Hitler was at peace with nature. Lots of pictures of Hitler with deers, with dogs, and other animals are often produced online, along with calling attention to animal welfare laws enacted by the Nazis, which banned vivisection, required anesthetic in the slaughtering of animals, and planned to engage in reforestation, protection of endangered animals, and more. These are sometimes cited to try to paint a picture of a man who cared about God's mandate to really take care of the earth. But as you mentioned in your presentation, it sounds like Hitler would have some ulterior motives to do all of those things. And so, how would you respond to this final argument?
Well, I think they're right that he did care about God's mandate to take care of the earth, but the God's mandate that he was obeying was the mandate of nature. That is, as a pantheist, uh, as I've already suggested, he deified nature. So of course he loved nature. He had a very deep love for nature. He loved to hike in the Bavarian Alps, for example. Yeah, Hitler had a very keen interest in nature and wanted other people to have that interest in nature as well, because he thought nature was God. Not because he thought that God had told him, not because he thought some Christian God had commanded, that he needs to take care of nature, but because he thought nature was deity itself.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I think that's something that, as you laid out in your presentation, that question almost answered itself, but it often gets brought up. So I think it was worth mentioning. As we come toward the end here, I have two final questions for you. So we've been tackling a lot of these points that are often made to try to defend Hitler, to defend the Nazis, and their actions during World War II, or at least downplay them. In some cases, even celebrate them. Right? As crazy as that may sound. And so, a lot of young men online, and actually a lot of young Christian men online today, are flirting with ethno nationalist and fascist ideologies. By way of warning, what lessons can the church learn today from looking at the Reichskirche and the complicity of many pastors with the Third Reich? And where did apathy or even full on support toward these ideas lead the average German Christian during World War II?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the warning that we can look at today is that when people begin discard, and again, getting back to my a point that I made earlier, the German Christians, the group that was most identified with the Nazis within the Protestant Church, had basically discarded the Bible as a standard, and so they were open to then whatever sort of came along. And I think that's one of the key things we can sort of take away here is that we need to make sure that we keep the Bible as our standard and uh, act in accordance with it. And if you look at the attitudes that Jesus had toward ethnic groups of his day, and one of the most hated ethnic groups of his day among the Jews was the Samaritans. And you look at what he has to say about the Samaritans, you'll see that he was very positive toward them. In fact, he very often held them up as being good, and like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, holds up the Samaritan as being the example of someone that's good, whereas the Jews were not so good in that particular example. Although I should say at the same time that for those that want to charge down the road of anti-Semitism, that Jesus loved the Jews. He had a deep love for the Jews. He wept, it says, over Jerusalem. He cried over Jerusalem, as he because they rejected him. So Jesus had a deep love for the Jews, but he also had a love for the Samaritans. And when he left the earth, he told his disciples that they were supposed to go out into Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. So they're supposed to evangelize everyone on the earth. And he taught an ethic of love for everyone. And that's sort of one of the key issues. I mean, when you look at people like Hitler or look in the left extremists too, like the communists, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, they don't talk about love, by the way. They don't talk about loving other people. Jesus talked about loving other people. We need to keep that central because that was central to what Jesus talked about. And so, if we're not, we need to be very careful that we don't get sucked in, because one thing that I see happening today is that there's incredible polarization that's taking place in American politics over the past couple of decades. We're becoming more and more polarized, and things are becoming more and more nasty. People are becoming more brutal toward each other. People are becoming very, very nasty toward each other. And it's not just one side, it's both the right and the left, that people are becoming more hateful, really, toward each other, instead of practicing the love that we're supposed to be practicing as Christians. So I think that's going to be really the big issue. And then you asked about the issue of apathy there. I mean, I think again that this is where we need to make sure that we don't just ignore these things that are going on, but we need to tackle them with a loving uh, touch, not trying to fight back in the way that they're fighting. Jesus said, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you." We're supposed to be exemplifying the love of Christ into our culture, and that's going to look quite different than sometimes the political debates or political things that are going on in our culture and society. We also need to avoid, and this I think is an important lesson too, one of the things that was going to benefit Hitler and was going to be, I think, a big element in driving people to him was pride. Pride in being a German, pride that we're one of the best countries of the world. We didn't really lose World War One. All these things that made them feel good about being a German. And I see some of the same things going on in some of the groups today. We're trying to, in the United States and other places, people are wanting to feel good about who they are, but instead of finding that identity in Christ, they're trying to find that pride and prideful identity in who they are as their ethnic identity or national identity or something like that. And pride can be a very powerful motivator, but it's not a good motivator. It's one of the chief sins, in fact, that we need to avoid. So I'd say that's another way we need to try to sort of avoid the pitfalls of the Third Reich.
Yeah, and absolutely. And to your point, if I can read a few Bible verses here, when we speak of
Sure.
Jesus not
Sure.
only speaking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, but also we see in the way that he goes well out of his way, especially going outside of where the average Jewish man, right, would actually be. We see, for example, we can think of Jesus and the woman at the well, right, the woman of Samaria. We look
Sure.
at John chapter 4, and I'm sure a lot of us know this story, but just to read a few verses from it. It says, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. and he had to pass through Samaria. Very important, because a lot of Jewish people, in fact, most Jewish men, would actually go out of their way to avoid Samaria,
Yeah.
and they successfully would do so, right? Because they had a lot of contempt
Mhm.
for the Samaritans. And yet, it's very interesting
Okay.
that John says he had to pass through Samaria. He had to pass through Samaria. Well, physically, right? That isn't the case. I mean, Jesus is God, so he can literally do whatever he wants. But even if you, even from a human charting, from going from one spot to another, plenty of people avoided Samaria. And yet we hear that he had to pass through there. And so it continues. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" And then John tells us, "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." And notice, right, Jesus here doesn't respond, by being like, "Well, rightfully so, we don't have any dealings with you guys. Oh, I didn't realize you were a Samaritan. Oh, never mind," right? like Jesus answers her,
Mhm.
and he says, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." And Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And we could keep reading here. I'm not going to sit here reading the whole
Yeah.
chapter, but the point is, the Lord Jesus doesn't rebuke her and say, "Oh, you're right. You Samaritan woman, you're not a part of my ethnos. Get out of here." All right. Jesus instead has this
She was
gospel
also a woman,
conversation with her. Yeah, go ahead.
and she's also a woman. She's also a woman who was living out of wedlock with a
Yeah.
man at that time, and he knew that.
Yeah. In fact, in the rest of this chapter, right, he calls her out for that, and he says, "You're right when you say that you have no husband, because you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're currently with isn't your husband." And yet, out of this whole interaction, what happens? The Samaritan woman comes back. She brings back all the townspeople, and they all come to faith in Jesus.
Mm,
And my understanding is, I've heard this said repeatedly, although I've not fact checked this myself. So people in the comments, I guess, feel free to fact check this. I've heard that some of the earliest Christian communities that we know of are actually in Samaria. And so it seems that the Samaritan woman, that this town, they actually take the gospel, and they take it, not like that. If I can
mhm,
pull this up here from your presentation, right? Unlike the propaganda of the Nazis, right, saying that baptism
mm,
did not make this person a non-Jew. Baptism in the gospel, it's not like, oh yeah, well, it did not make these Samaritans non-Samaritans. Uh, no, it seems like these people actually believed in Jesus,
mhm,
just like a lot of other people that were not the
mhm,
Pharisees, that were not Jesus's kinsmen, although there were many of his kinsmen that did believe in him, like the apostles. There are many of his kinsmen
mhm,
that didn't, and we see the gospel repeatedly go out to these other people. The Lord Jesus speaks with a Syrophoenician woman, right, who wants a demon to be cast out of her daughter, and at first he says that he
mhm,
came for the children of Israel. All right, and people could say, "Aha!" for his ethnos and whatever. Uh, and he says it is not right to give the food that is for the children to the dogs. And she says, "But even the dogs eat of the scraps that fall off the master's table."
mhm.
And the Lord doesn't like send her away, right, and say, "Oh, we don't share an ethnos." He heals her daughter instantly, right at that moment.
And,
Her daughter was healed.
and in her case, he actually says, "Great is your faith." And actually, there
That's
were
right.
only two people that Jesus said were of great faith. They were both Gentiles. One was the centurion, and one was this Syrophoenician woman.
Yeah, and of course, the final example I'll give, which is from of Peter, right, where the Lord gives Peter. This is after the crucifixion and the resurrection and the ascension of the Lord, and we hear the story in Acts, in the book of Acts, of Peter, right, receiving a dream from the Lord, or a vision. I always forget if it's a vision or a dream, where the Lord shows him all of these different animals that he's made. And he tells him, "Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Far be it from me. No unclean thing has ever touched my lips." And the Lord says, "Do not dare call unclean what I have made clean." Right. And then what happens after that? The first Gentile believers who are baptized. right? Shortly after that, because the Lord has sent Cornelius to send his people to find Peter. And so the Gospels are very, very clear that when it comes to the gospel, when it comes to the radical uh, changing power of the gospel to change us down to our core, it
Mhm.
transcends ethnicity, it transcends borders, it transcends national affiliations, and the gospel is for all people, right? And the gospel is there for all. And this bizarre sort of oh well, it needs to be just our ethnicity, and we need to have be ethno nationalist and get everybody else that doesn't fall within this criteria that I just made out of here. Even fellow Christians, right? As some of these people online would argue that they would say, oh, if we achieve the dream ethno state, all of these fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, well, yeah, they can go be brothers and sisters in Christ elsewhere because I don't want them here. And it's like, man, where do we get off biblically on this idea when this is not at all what the Lord sets forth, and it's not at all what
Mhm.
the example that the apostles give. And to the point of a friend of the channel, Theosophical Wanderings, he was pointed out on Twitter recently that this sort of logic would deem that it would be defensible for, say, Gentile Christians to say to the Apostle Paul, well, thank you so much, Paul, for bringing the gospel to us. But you're not of the same ethnos as us. And so we would actually like for you to leave, right? Like they didn't say that, but had they said that, some of these people online would argue that that would be perfectly okay. Right? They could kick the Apostle
Mhm.
Paul out on behalf of this ethnicity, and I think to the average Christian who, to your point earlier, right, actually has his Bible open in hand, this sort of talking point should be just ridiculous. And so,
Yeah. And Paul does make that, yeah, Paul makes that clear in a lot of places in his epistles that there's no dividing line between the Jews and the Gentiles, between the Greeks and the Jews. I mean, he makes it abundantly clear again and again.
yeah, and so, well, here we come to our final question, and you already kind of spoke to this a little bit, but I'd like still to end on a final note from you. What is a final word that you would like to give to these young men today who, in response to the tumultuous times that we live in, right, of unprecedented, well, I'm not fully unprecedented, but with the technology that we have, unprecedented levels of immorality that they see in the culture as they see the sort of the fall of Christianity and all sorts of surveys that we do that are starting to turn
Mhm.
toward these sort of fascist and racialist ideologies for an answer to this chaos. What is your final word that you would like to give to these young men?
Yeah, well, one thing that I read this morning in my personal Bible reading was, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is the law and the prophets. That's what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Is that how you want to be treated? How do you want to be treated? In your life, go out and treat other people that way. And don't even, and it's not, it's interesting. It's not just a negative. It's not, don't do unto others what you don't want them to do to you. It's do unto others what you want them to do to you. And I think if we'll do that, we'll settle all these problems. And others, by the way, includes everyone. It doesn't just include. There's nothing there, putting a boundary around it to just some people. It's all people.
Yeah, and we see if I can cite a Bible verse here, right? To your point, Matthew 5:44-45. But I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. And if I can say one final thing as well, and we'll wrap it up here. I think it's also very easy for us, and I've had to check myself even right with over the last several weeks as my timeline, like I said at the beginning of this video, has been flooded with so much of this stuff, where it can be very easy, I think, to even just completely start being overcome with whether it's righteous anger or whether it's righteous anger that then ends up in a sinful place. I think it's very easy even for us as we see people that are swept up in a lot of this craziness and these talking points, and almost
Mhm.
justifying like I'm going to pray on these people's downfall and like I hate these people, and we shouldn't be that way, right? And the same way that I think that we would say to people that are falling for these ideologies, hey, actually open your Bible, right? Learn to love. your enemies, learn to love your neighbor. I think likewise for us, I think that the best thing that we can do, and I think it's okay to give, even public pushback. I think we should give public pushback, and that's a large part of what this video is, to these sort of talking points. At the same time, in our own life, when we know people that are flirting with these ideas, when we have people that are kind of succumbing to the propaganda they see online on this stuff, I think we should also not approach that just from a place of like, oh, I hate you and I'm going to crush you. And it should be more from a place of, hey, I think that you're deeply mistaken. I think that this is antithetical to the gospel. And from a place of love, I am going to speak out against this with you. I'm going to reason with you as a brother. I'm going to talk about this with you. Unfortunately, if things get to a place where we have to have a public discussion, we can have that, but then always just doing that in love, and not being overcome with hatred in that way for anybody. And so, once again, thank you so much, brother, for coming on today. If people want to check out your books one more time, I want to read their names here. The one most relevant to this video is Hitler's Religion, The Twisted Ideas That Drove the Third Reich. And your other book that you wrote specifically on Hitler is Hitler's Ethic, The Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress. Is there anything else besides your books that you would like to shout out or say before we head out of here?
Well, actually, the book Hitler's Ethic is incredibly expensive. It's published by a Palgrave Macmillan, which is a scholarly publisher that's jacked the prices way high. So I'd actually encourage you more to buy my more recent book, which is much cheaper. I wouldn't buy Hitler's Ethic; it's too expensive. But I have a newer book called Darwinian Racism: How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism. And there I actually do take on white nationalism in the last chapter of that. Although most of the white nationalism I deal with, most white nationalism actually, at least from my research, was anti-Christian in character and was more pro-Darwinian, more pushing a Darwinian agenda. So I deal with that, and I don't deal with Christian nationalism per se, but I do deal with white nationalism.
All right. Well, thank you so much, brother. And who knows, maybe we can have you on another time as well to discuss these issues further. But it's been a pleasure having you, and we'll see you next time.